No, no, getting your suitcase.
I'd like to thank you for joining this evening for our basic Buddhist teachings. It happens every Friday. It's a class Sokuzan had me start a couple of years ago after my transmission to, I think in a lot of ways, give me a chance to practice teaching and share some of what he's been having me study. And over the years, really had a chance to branch out into a lot of directions. But there's really been two areas of Buddhism that continue to really inspire me. And the main one is simply the practice of seated meditation. It's not maybe the most glamorous topic considering 2,500 years of history within Buddhism, but it is perhaps the most moving thing that I confront on a daily basis. And so tonight, my intention is to talk about a contemporary Zen master. His name was Kodo Sawaki Roshi, and also went by Wandering Kodo or Homeless Kodo, and he lived in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the reason he garnered so much attention was that Buddhism in our lineage, the Soto Zen lineage in Japan, had really fallen into a situation of just functioning on a level of ceremony.
We're trying to make it quieter.
Yeah. Anybody need to check their phone real quick or get some popcorn, go to the bathroom? I think it's in a sense, like, for those of you that can't see, there's like a bunch of stuff happening in the Zendo when you're scurrying around, not in a bad way, not like scurrying like a rat, but just like moving quickly to adjust some air conditioners and check in with Shoto about spotty mist shaving maybe, or I can make this work for what we're going to talk about tonight because Kodo Sawaki Roshi, and one hand had a great sense of humor and then another had no sense of humor. But to just give you a background of his life, he lived an outlandish life that some people were born into prominent Buddhist families. Some people were born into comfort and luxury and chose a renunciant life. And Kurosawaki was not one of those people. He was born and at an early age, both of his parents died. He was sent to live with another caretaker. That caretaker died. And at a young age, he found himself helping to run a gambling den, living in the red light district. And so at a young age, being exposed to the most stereotypical aspects of samsara, the most stereotypical aspects of suffering. It's not to say it's not everywhere, but he was in a very difficult situation. And he was abused and he was beaten. And he said his first real profound emotional connection to the Dharma happened at a brothel, that he was walking and there was this crowd and there was this woman wailing and her husband had died while in a brothel. And he was struck by the depth of suffering. And there was a lot of layers to it. Culturally, there's a lot of layers. It's not just that her husband had died and it was with a prostitute, a sex worker, but it was that now in Japan, it's like every so many years you have a memorial where the family comes back together, you make offerings, you remember this person, and that will always be the part the community will remember. And so he started to awaken this way-seeking mind, it's called. And he ran away from home at the age of 17 to the most famous temple, Buddhist temple in Japan, Eheji, that was founded by Dogen Zenji in the 13th century. And they wouldn't let him in because Eheji does not ordain monks. You do not go to Eheji to be ordained. You have to like have a temple here. You have a teacher and that teacher ordains you and they send a letter of recommendation that says this person is prepared and qualified to study at Eheji. So the monks tried to turn him away and he wouldn't go. So he sat outside of the temple for 2 days. And he was starving because he'd been walking. He had nothing. It was a long journey for him. And so the monk came out and he said, well, I'm starving. And so the monk said, well, have some rice gruel and be on your way. Yes.
You see, what year was this? I mean,
Kurosawaki was born in 1880. So this probably would have been around 1897, I believe, if he was 17. And when he was offered the rice gruel, he said, in that case, I'm not hungry. He essentially was saying, I'm not leaving. If, maybe you won't take pity on me and bring me in because I'm hungry, but you'll send me away with food, I'd rather sit here and starve. So eventually they did let him in as a lay practitioner and as a worker. So he just had to work and he just desperately wanted to be ordained. And was given the runaround and kind of taken advantage. And it was his first realization that not all monks were kind, that they didn't all have some great bodhicitta, that there was people that were just pursuing their own ends. But he eventually was ordained and spent a great deal of time actually studying Pure Land Buddhism. And so Pure Land Buddhism, the recitation of the names of the name of the Buddha, Amitabha, influenced his teachings throughout his life. Which is interesting because he is known as revitalizing meditation practice in Japan. He was relentless in his practice of meditation. And I wanted to share, because I really wanted to share about this flavor, and it wasn't unique. This is not something he created. He really dug down into what would be called Dogen Zenji Zen, like Dogen's Zen. And this is a direct quote from Dogen's, a record of things heard. Dogen said, sitting itself, meditation itself is the practice of the Buddha. Sitting itself is non-doing. It is nothing but the true form of the self. Apart from sitting, there is nothing to seek as the Buddha Dharma. And Sawaki Roshi's pursuit of Zazen, as I said, was quite relentless. He took his vows of poverty very seriously, refused to own anything, to claim ownership of a temple, and he went into retreat, and his meditation practice started at 2 a.m. and went until 10 p.m. without break. Essentially, he would sit for 20 hours a day, would use the restroom, he would eat a meal a day. He became quite emaciated, but primarily eating rice and maybe some pickle. And that continued. And I wanted to read to you about this flavor of Zazen, shikantaza, that Kurosawaki emphasized. He says, you have to forget any results of your effort. Result-oriented practice is merely an enterprise, a business. Monks say that they have no time to do Zazen. I always say Zazen is an activity that comes to nothing. There is nothing more admirable than this activity that comes to nothing. To do something with a goal is really worthless. This practice, because it takes you out of the world of loss and gain, it should be practiced. And there's a term for this, musho toku, just means no gain. And that our practice is practice purely for the sake of the practice itself. That meditation is only practiced for meditation's sake. I think that teaching isn't necessarily literal. It's like when Sokuzan was talking during As It Is, it's you say something so you can see more clearly what's happening. So to say sitting meditation is for meditation's sake. We can't just drop away all the expectations and demands and hopes and fears we have around practice, but it can remind us of how our practice can't be interfered, because as soon as we take that form, as Dogen says, this is sitting Buddha. Sawaki Roshi says something similarly, that you just sit as the Buddha. In a sense, you don't even practice Zazen. It's not something you practice. You immediately are Zazen Shikantaza. I think the reason this Musho Toku stands out to me, this no gain Zazen or Zazen for Zazen's sake, is so profound for me, is that it's not just meditation for meditation's sake. It's buying groceries for buying groceries' sake. It's waking up for waking up's sake. It's making the bed for making the bed's sake. It's encouraging us to look at the immediacy, and you could say the intimacy of the precise thing we're engaging. But Zazen creates the container, and he even emphasizes, he says, Zazen is going to make things worse, very much like Sokuzan will say, that when you sit down to meditate, when you hold very still, you actually begin to see all the ways in which you distract yourself, all the ways in which you fight with yourself. So we need this container. It's not just an idealism, it's a situation that reminds us as soon as we take our posture, as soon as we sit down, it's not that nothing else is happening, but what continues to happen is not an indication of our practice. Just the mind doing what the mind does, its sight, its smell, its taste, its sound, its touch, doing what those do. And our only intention is to just sit zazen, to just sit. Shikantaza. And I think as our community continues to grow, it's a helpful reminder, because all of us have said that I don't have time to sit anymore. I don't have time to sit. I don't have time to practice anymore. And it's not that we don't occasionally, it's not that we don't have a lot to do, that there aren't things that may need our attention, but to somehow find a way to reconnect with that inspiration of relating directly to the mind. That we return to that on a daily basis, that in a sense, I don't know, is there anything more important than that? Because as the teachings say, death comes without warning. At that time, the Dharma will be my only help. And so all those things that we prioritize to put off our practice, don't put off death, put off the actuality of that this human form will come to an end. And so Kurosawaki had this incredible impact on meditation in Japan, to the point where towards the end of his life, he had literally thousands and thousands of followers. He would put on these retreats yearly. He would do sessions throughout the year. He would go anywhere he was asked to teach, and they would have 500 people show up, and they were having to create temporary facilities. They were having to create multiple zendos to accommodate all of these teachings. And I think it's important to acknowledge that he had a direct impact on our lineage, that while he's not a direct lineage holder coming through Kobun, he was one of Kobun Chino's teachers, and his monastery is still thriving in Japan as a center for meditation practice at Antaiji. And nowadays, I think they might wait until 3 a.m. to start practice, but it's still a 3 a.m. until 10 p.m. And his lineage has made its way over to the States in a formal sense down in Bloomington with Sanshin Zen Center and Shohaku Okamun. And they similarly sit a pretty rigorous session a couple times a year, where there's no talks, no samu, there's just sitting, taking your meals and sitting, returning to sitting. And so I told Sokuzan before I came over, I forgot all my notes. They're all at home. But I'm really curious or interested to talk about meditation practice, because I think that that's one thing that I'm never tired of hearing Sokuzan talk about, to have an entire book of 108 ways to meditate. It's important that there's not just one. It's important that it wasn't just one thing. It's 108, it's 208, it's 2080. There's constantly a returning to that intention to train. Some other questions about Koro, or no gain Zen, as it is called? Yudao.
So what is happening when someone sits for 20 hours, and it doesn't sound very sustainable? And have you ever done that?
Oh, once, I guess. Yeah, once, one night. We sat session from 5:40 until 9, and then we started sitting at 10 p.m. again and went till 6 a.m. So that was, probably 20 hours in there. Maybe it's not sustainable. I think that's an important reminder. It's not something we need to emulate. But I do think we need to recognize that there's an importance in training. And if we look at Zen meditation, the whole history of Zen is stamped with these figures revitalizing practice. So if we go back to Bodhidharma came from India to China, where Buddhism had spread everywhere. There was Buddhism everywhere, but it was always in the form of scholasticism and study and what they call the precept school. And he didn't come with a form or a system. He just came with the practice of meditating. I think that is similarly what Dogen did. He did not feel that Buddhism in Japan emphasized sitting anymore. So he went back and he met Ru Jing, and he came to Japan and started the Soto Zen school. Kodo Sawaki Roshi did this. I feel that Shinryu Suzuki also had a similar sentiment. He was very discouraged by the pomp and the ritualism that had predominated all aspects of priest and monk life in Japan, and had a real inspiration to revitalize that practice of meditation. So simply for us, as we continue to practice, and as Sokuzan's vision continues to show up, the refrain we always hear is train the mind. And so we shouldn't lose the weight of how important actually sitting down and training is in the midst of all we have to do in order to help others to practice.
How do we not attach to, like you were saying, it's not a goal-oriented practice, to having the quantity be important? I need to sit this much, otherwise, I don't know what.
The only thing I could say to that is I just relate to that as we have to relate to that as individuals. And so any one of you had that conversation with Sokuzan, look at how you're practicing and where you might be able to schedule more, or maybe where you should practice less. And so sometimes it feels like it's the tension that's important. It's not so much getting to the goal or getting to the mark or getting to the quantity, but it's the tension that we put on ourselves that in a sense, it seems like it creates some energy to like, I really want to do this. I really would like to do this. And so maybe we catapult in one direction of not practicing so much, and then we come back and we're practicing a lot. And it's not about finding a point on that spectrum to maintain, but looking at the tension and returning to the intention. Jan.
Agenda is no gain the same as failure?
I don't think so, but it could be, because again, it's very subjective. It's like, how do you relate to those failure or no gain? But no gain could have incredible aspects of failure, but it could have incredible expressions of relative success. But it's not an attachment, because there are times when you meditate and you might have profound experiences or pleasant sensations or feelings, and that doesn't mean you stop practicing shikantaza. And at other times you may feel miserable, and you're just having to look at how narcissistic you are, how tied into your stories you are. But that's also, the no gain is not about content. The no gain is just the attitude or the intention that whatever shows up, I relate to it. Sitting for sitting's sake, it's suffering for suffering's sake, it's enjoying oneself for enjoying oneself's sake. But having to recognize that none of it can be maintained, it can't last. Shoto?
Going, why is it that the meditation practice is something that gets left throughout the years and has to be returned to by all these masters?
I think it's difficult. I think because it is not rewarding. It's much more rewarding to create a following. It's much more rewarding to get a post at a high temple or monastery where you're being compensated and you have recognition and you have prestige. So it just seems that because it is coded in this idea of spirituality, it may feel like the path, but it's also very much about identity. And so it's difficult to come back to a practice where you have to constantly lose, to constantly return to losing. I think that's something that allows us to relate to the Bodhisattva path, though, is it keeps us right in the midst of the world we're endeavoring to relate to. Doesn't give us much of a chance to elevate. It's just you're right down in it with everybody else.
Sugar bounding. I sometimes think that our generation is like the first American generation to learn from Americans. I'm curious if that gives us a particular advantage or what that might do to the practice of the religion of Buddhism.
I don't know that there's any advantage or disadvantage that could be broadcast because we're learning from the teachers that studied with, you know, the Tibetans that came to America, the Chinese Zen masters, the Japanese Zen masters, the Vietnamese Zen masters, the, you know, the Thai Bhantes. I don't know that there's an advantage there. It's really about, do you have a connection where you can hear what is being said beyond your concepts? I don't know if there's more to that. Go ahead.
Sugar bowing. I think I'm trying to look at maybe some contrast in the situation Kodo Sawaki was seeing, where there's just, well, I think you said pomp and ritual, and if there's less of that here because it's so new. Bowing.
There may be a little bit of modification, but it's not that the ritual couldn't also be used completely in service of the student. So it's not to do away with that. It's not to say that we shouldn't go and learn those forms or learn how to practice in that way, but it has to be, or feels like it needs to be, with the attitude of relating to it directly as it is, as opposed to the credential that it may be taken for. So you can't really look at any aspect of Buddhism and say, well, that's inherently a disadvantage or inherently an advantage. It's our responsibility as students that if that's the way in which it shows up, that's the way in which we receive it. I think that Suzuki Roshi gave his students the instruction that wherever you go, practice the way they practice. And that would be interesting. There's a certain conditioning that we put ourselves through in being here, that we have some sort of sense that when we go somewhere else, we want to show people how insightful our way of practicing is, instead of just being a simpleton. And, you know, if you go to a Catholic church, pray like a Catholic. You go to San Francisco Zen Center, practice like they practice at San Francisco Zen Center. If you're here, practice the way it's being presented here. So it's not setting up a standard. It's not the forms themselves that have the power. It's really our discrimination that obscures what we're relating to.
What is, like, even just staying here with that same idea, what is the value of receiving teachings the way they're being presented?
When we have the opportunity to not direct our own practice, it challenges the way in which we pick and choose. And so when we come into a situation like Sokokoji, you come into this monastery, you study with Sokuzan with these particular teachings, I don't feel that what's being said is that these have an inherent value, which is lacking in other forms, but it gives you a very precise direction that does not particularly compromise to your preferences, although it may modify. And it challenges us as students to relate to something as it shows up in the midst of our liking and in the midst of our disliking, that regardless of which of those two show up, our intention is to relate to them anyway. So it points out the discrimination that occurs quite spontaneously in the mind. And my experience in other spiritual communities is that when they have, which can be completely helpful, but when they have an egalitarian approach, everyone's just trying to please everybody else. And no one's willing to create this sort of tension that occurs when you have a teacher. And that's something that if you look out through the history of Buddhism has been an important part, that it's not just everyone deciding as a consensus how we can do this, that there is some sort of direction that is given. And if one were to have some insight, they may modify that direction, and then that is how their students would practice, but to not to modify things arbitrarily just because of something doesn't feel pleasant. I try to look at it as, how is this an expression of the entire world? That we don't want to isolate this situation and create an artificial God realm. But this is the same thing we relate to when we step outside, that the world is not always going to accommodate us in the way we would prefer. And so we can live our lives avoiding that and fighting with it when it arises, or we can train in a container that shows us how to relate to that out of intelligence, because it is an inevitable part of living in this world, it seems.
That reminds me of that area, like Sogazan's teaching, do it anyway. What does it mean to do it anyway?
I may not understand that, but the way it shows up is, it's again coming back to the tension that as a student we have to look at everything that's being pointed at very carefully, that to do it anyway as a standard may be a form of ignorance, that you don't actually have to feel or look at anything, you just become this one-track minded person. But when we hear that teaching, it also can help create this sort of tension to point out where we're still grasping, where we're still hoping to retain some sort of individuality or sovereignty. So as Sogazan often says, it's about awareness. And so when I hear teaching like that, that sounds very much like an order. I would come back to, what does it mean to relate to that, not out of our prejudice, but out of our awareness. And the way we do that is noticing whatever arises when that instruction is given. Jishin?
Bowing, how meditation for the meditation's sake is the bodhisattva path? Bowing.
Because we don't relate to the world out of whether it merits our attention or not. We're not evaluating based on some sort of system or structure that says this is good, this is bad, but we just relate to it. And so when we have an attitude or we have an intention to practice for the sake of practice, to just sit down for sitting down, it feels like the idea is that then we relate to a situation very directly as it is. We relate to it for its own sake. It has its own validity, and it doesn't need our particular evaluation to give it merit or demerit. And so it really, to me, shows how subtly we find ways to create discrimination and prejudice in our own minds. And so we start with something that's a little bit more simple, in a sense, of just sitting there. And this is what's interesting. This isn't a unique practice to even Zen Buddhism. So Dogen talked about this, but this is not just unique to Zen. It shows up in Tibetan Buddhism as well. One of Trungpa Rinpoche's teachers, Khenpo Gangshar, called it Kusulu meditation, and it describes shikantaza to a T. It's describing the very same thing as it looks to me, that's being talked about by Dogen and by Huineng and by Bankei and by Sokuzan and by all of these great teachers.
Thank you, Jishin Bowing. So that approach of doing things for the sake of doing them, does it exclude others? As I'm comparing to our intention to save others, to receive others. bowing?
I come back, I would say the way I hear it most often is to be with all things. And that this practice of doing something for its own sake is, to me, that is exactly what it is. It's being with something for its own sake, just being with it as it arises. I don't see any disparity between the two.
Thank you.
Thank you. So great.
So Grand bowing. We receive the Bodhisattva vows. Do these vows infer that there will be action that arises out of being a Bodhisattva? Bowing.
I don't know if this is helpful, but it feels like what is being indicated is that action will arise out of the situation. That action doesn't arise out of a source and acted upon a receiver, that the situation is the action. But that at the same time, the intention, the path quality, the way we work with it may have more of a endeavoring to be kind, endeavoring to be supportive, endeavoring to relate to people with some curiosity. So those have expressive qualities to them.
So Grand bowing, you mentioned that one wandering Kodo noticed that there were monks that weren't kind. What would a community that had authentic or genuine bodhisattvas, how would that show up? What would the characteristics be?
I don't know that I'm in a position to comment on that. And I hope this isn't going too far from what you're saying. And if it is, you can bring me back to it. But we each as practitioners, I feel like need to return to our inspiration, which is our suffering and the way in which our confusion around our suffering gets projected into the world to create further suffering or create more stirring of the pot. And to really emphasize that we aren't done, that there's work to do on the path. And that when, as much as we can, to relate to these teachings that encourage us to be patient, which is how I understand. I feel like a lot of Sokuzan's teachings are encouraging us to be patient, although not phrased that way. It's hold your seat, don't do anything unless you have to, don't hook up your vocal cords. It's recognizing that there's a tremendous impulse to function out of that confusion. And if we can soften that a little bit, if we can just let it eat us up inside a little bit, not to the point of being a martyr, that we may have a little bit more what might be called respect for one another, because we recognize we're not unique and that we're relating to that. I don't know what that is. I feel pretty strongly about this, and I'm not sure what that is, but the sitting practice, it's always the sitting practice for me. And that if we have a deep respect for the teacher and a deep respect for the sitting practice, and you see a room full of people that have been brought together based on these teachings and this practice, that we might have a sort of kindness that allows them to have their confusion in such a way that they're allowed to sit next to you, they're allowed to sit in this room, sit in this space in their confusion. Because while we're all expressing that in different ways, we have an intention, and that, and it's not a word I hear Sokuzan use a great deal, but have some respect for one another. At the very least, we made it here to do this. And I don't want to put that up as a credential, but it's hard to be here. That's all I'm saying. Yes.
What I often point to, and this is a reminder, not to you, but to everyone, as I say, respect people's confusion. Because if you're just looking around for somebody to respect is respectable, something that's, you can find some of that, but quite often that's based on a relative condition of trying to appear respectable. And people are to look at somebody's confusion and respect that confusion and know that they're I don't mean to take over your Dharma talk here, I just mean it's just so important. You can't respect the confusion here. Very gonna be very difficult to respect in other places, so simply put, thank you.
Thank you, Sokuzan.
Soker and bowing. If someone is not a meditator, but is showing up as a person in the community that's putting others before themselves, are they somehow not on the path?
Really appreciate everyone's willingness to allow me to express my confusion up here, and that's a lot of what happens. And what shows up for me is Sokuzan and I had Dokusan, a pretty long Dokusan today, and we were talking a little bit about some of those early koans, and one of them is, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? And the one exchange around that stood out more than any others was a student asking their teacher that, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? And the teacher kind of yelled at them and said, what does it matter what Bodhidharma's intention was? What is your intention? And it's really hard not to want to evaluate, is someone on the path? Are they not on the path? And it's just absolutely none of your business to the extent in which they express their Buddha nature. That what is your intention? What is your clarity? What is your understanding? What is your practice? And you could relate to everybody as a Buddha, and you get to be the sole sentient being surrounded by these profoundly enlightened beings that are just there to help you. There was a poem by the Sufi master Hafiz, and I'd have to paraphrase it, but the poem goes something like, how do I listen? As if everything I hear were the dying words of my master. And this is mirrored in Tibetan Buddhism, which encourages practitioners to hear everything as sacred mantra, that every noise you hear is a sacred expression. And that's not to be amped up through emotions and some idealism, but when you look at anybody else, what their motivation, intentions, or understanding are completely incomprehensible to us. We can never know that, but what can we know is the way in which they help us see our own mind. That's something I can say, but I don't know that it's so simple to do, because the relative backing is there are good people and bad people and right people and wrong people. And we want to get a hold of that, and we want to mitigate our own suffering. But no matter how awful somebody is, the degree to which we accuse them of being awful is the extent to which we are confused. And it's not complicity. I'm not saying that we acquiesce to the demands of the world. But again, I come back to this idea that nothing that is happening can excuse us from our own confusion. We can do our best to help, we can do our best to pacify or to support, but there has to be some willingness to acknowledge our own lack of clarity and yet still have an intention to show up. And I think that that's maybe part of where the path becomes lonely. Is there a final question this evening? Thank you. We'll stand and dedicate the mirror.
May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Ji ho san ji ji fu shi song bu sa bo 10 directions, the 3 times, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna Paramita. O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sogukoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.
Yeah.